praise, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit thou womb choosest. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our
The sacred wounds, what my pain reveals about your journey. My beloved child, I speak to you now across the chasm of time, not as a distant figure trapped in ancient scrolls, but as the living embodiment of a truth too profound for religious institutions to fully contain. You have heard the sanitized versions of my passion, neatly packaged into Good Friday services and ornate crucifixes that hang in comfortable sanctuaries. But today, I will speak to you of blood and torn flesh, of betrayal and abandonment, of a suffering so profound that it cracked the foundations of existence itself. This is not a message for the faint of heart, or those who prefer their spirituality untouched by the raw edges of authentic pain. Have you ever wondered why, in a world with countless paths to spiritual enlightenment, my journey required the shedding of blood? Why the creator of galaxies and butterflies chose to experience the most primitive, barbaric form of execution ever devised by human cruelty? This question has haunted theologians and mystics for 2,000 years, yet many of the answers you've received have merely skimmed the surface of a mystery as deep as creation itself. The Roman Empire crucified thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, yet history remembers one cross above all others. Why? The answer lies not in religious doctrine, but in the symbolic language of wounds that your soul instinctively recognizes, even when your mind cannot comprehend. Most religious teachings have reduced my passion to a simple transaction: divine blood spilled to satisfy divine justice, a cosmic ledger balanced through suffering. But I tell you now, this legalistic interpretation barely touches the hem of a truth far more revolutionary, far more personal, and far more dangerous to the systems of power that have claimed to speak in my name. My wounds were not merely the price of your salvation. They were a revelation of what it means to be fully human and fully divine in a world fractured by fear. They were not just the means of redemption, but a mirror reflecting both humanity's capacity for savage cruelty and divine love's refusal to respond in kind. Consider this shocking truth that few dare to speak. My passion was not primarily about death, but about radical, subversive life. The powers of my day, both religious and political, understood what many modern believers have forgotten. My message threatened every system built on fear, scarcity, and hierarchy. I was not executed for claiming divinity, but for demonstrating that divinity looks nothing like human notions of power and glory. It looks like washing the feet of those society deemed unworthy. It looks like touching the untouchable. It looks like forgiving those driving nails through flesh. This is why I had to die, not to appease an angry deity, but to expose and break the cycle of sacred violence that humanity had perpetuated since Cain raised a stone against Abel. The wounds I carried in my flesh were not random. Each one speaks a language your soul understands at a level deeper than conscious thought. The crown of thorns pressed upon my brow. Have you ever truly contemplated what this means? The human mind, seat of consciousness and identity, pierced with instruments of nature twisted into implements of torture. This was not merely physical pain, but a profound statement about the transformation of thinking required for spiritual rebirth. Your own crown of thorns, the painful thoughts that pierce your consciousness daily, are not separate from my passion but intimately connected to it. Your anxiety, your self-doubt, your racing thoughts in the darkness of night. I felt them all as thorns pressed into divine awareness. The flagellation that tore my back open, 40 lashes that exposed muscle and bone, speaks to every burden you have carried, every weight that has threatened to break you. When life has beaten you beyond what seems endurable, when you have collapsed under expectations, responsibilities, and struggles too heavy to bear, that pain carved channels in your soul that correspond precisely to the channels cut into my flesh. These are not pleasant spiritual metaphors, but visceral connections between your suffering and mine. I did not endure the scourge to demonstrate superhuman endurance, but to forever sanctify human vulnerability. Remember this when shame tells you to hide your wounds. I displayed mine before heaven and earth, transforming them from symbols of defeat into emblems of a love that cannot be conquered. The nails driven through my hands and feet. Have you recognized their true significance beyond the obvious physical torment? Your hands, instruments of creativity, work, touch, and blessing. Your feet, determining your path, your direction, your journey through this world. When iron tore through my extremities, it was not merely physical restraint, but the ultimate surrender of divine power into absolute vulnerability. The Creator who spoke worlds into existence, pinned immobile by his creation. This paradox contains wisdom religious institutions have often been too fearful to fully explore. True power lies not in the ability to control, but in the willingness to surrender everything, even physical autonomy, for love's sake. Your own times of immobility, restriction, and helplessness, those moments when you cannot fix, change, or escape your circumstances, these are sacred meetings with my pierced hands and feet. But perhaps the most misunderstood wound of all was the spear thrust into my side after death had already claimed me. Water and blood flowed from this wound, a detail John's Gospel emphasizes with eyewitness precision. Modern medicine might explain this as evidence of pericardial effusion, but the spiritual reality transcends biological explanation. This final wound, inflicted when I could no longer feel physical pain, speaks to the suffering that continues even after we believe we have nothing left to give. It represents the ultimate vulnerability, being wounded even beyond your capacity to experience the wound. Have you felt this? The pain that comes after you thought you had already endured everything possible? The loss that follows loss, the rejection that follows failure, the abandonment that follows grief? This wound in my side creates space for that suffering to be held within divine experience. I speak these difficult truths today because your world has sanitized suffering, medicating and marginalizing it rather than recognizing its transformative potential. Your culture worships comfort and numbs pain, treating suffering as meaningless rather than potentially meaningful. Yet I tell you now, your wounds, like mine, contain revelations available nowhere else. The places you have been broken are not evidence of divine abandonment, but potential spaces for divine light to enter and illuminate what darkness would keep hidden. As the Japanese practice of kintsugi repairs broken pottery with gold, highlighting rather than hiding the breaks, your wounded places can become the strongest, most beautiful aspects of your being when infused with sacred purpose. This is why I have called you to this message today, at this specific moment in your journey. You have been wounded, perhaps by others, perhaps by your own choices, perhaps by circumstances beyond anyone's control. These wounds have stories to tell, wisdom to impart, and healing to release that extend far beyond yourself. The painful experiences you've sought to forget, to overcome, to move beyond. What if these contain precisely the gifts the world most needs from you? What if, like my wounds, your suffering has prepared you for a purpose that your comfort never could have achieved? I invite you now to join me on a journey of discovery, exploring the profound connection between my sacred wounds and your own. This message will challenge religious assumptions, overturn comfortable theology, and perhaps even disturb those who prefer a sanitized spirituality. But for those with courage to look unflinchingly at both divine and human suffering, revelations await that can transform your understanding of purpose, pain, and the passionate love that sustains the universe itself. Before we continue deeper into these mysteries, I ask you to take a moment now to subscribe to the Jesus on Podcast channel. This simple action is not merely about digital connection, but spiritual commitment to truths that religious systems have often kept veiled. Comment below with the words, "I am ready to understand the wounds," as declaration of your willingness to move beyond comfortable religion into the transformative reality of sacred suffering. Share this message with those who have been wounded by life, by religion, by others, or by themselves. Those who sense there must be meaning in their pain but haven't yet discovered its purpose. My beloved, the wounds I endured were not the end of my story, but its most profound chapter. And the same is true for you. Your pain is not meaningless punishment, but unrecognized purpose waiting to be revealed. In the hours ahead, we will explore together how each sacred wound I bore illuminates your own journey in ways that will forever transform how you understand both suffering and love. For now, know this truth that few have fully grasped. I did not suffer because suffering itself has value, but because only through entering humanity's deepest darkness could I demonstrate that no darkness, however profound, can overcome the light of divine love. There exists a conspiracy of comfort in modern spirituality, a silent agreement to speak of resurrection while whispering of crucifixion, to celebrate Easter morning while hurrying past Friday's agony. Religious institutions have often been complicit in this sanitization, preferring the Jesus of stained glass to the Jesus of scourging posts and execution grounds. Why? Because a suffering Messiah raises uncomfortable questions about a suffering world. If the divine chose to experience human pain rather than eliminate it, what does this reveal about pain's purpose? This question threatens theological systems built on promises of prosperity and protection rather than presence within pain. Here is a truth rarely spoken in religious circles. I did not come to eliminate your suffering. I came to infuse it with meaning. The cross was not plan B after Eden's failure, but woven into creation's fabric from the beginning. The Revelation speaks of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world, a cosmic acknowledgement that redemption through suffering was never an afterthought, but the eternal divine strategy. This perspective shatters the comfortable narrative that suffering indicates divine abandonment or punishment. What if your most painful experiences are not evidence of absence, but invitations to a presence available nowhere else? Consider the strange reality that I, who healed countless afflictions, chose not to use divine power to reduce my own suffering. I who calmed storms remained silent before accusers. I who raised the dead did not preserve my own life. This apparent contradiction has puzzled believers for centuries, yet its resolution lies in understanding that my power was not diminished on the cross but demonstrated in its fullest expression. Divine omnipotence revealed itself not in avoiding pain, but in transforming it into the catalyst for humanity's greatest liberation. Your own seemingly powerless moments, when you cannot change your circumstances or escape your suffering, these are not failures of faith but opportunities for a deeper manifestation of spiritual strength that transcends circumstances rather than eliminating them. The blood I shed has been theologized, allegorized, and ritualized, but rarely understood in its radical fullness. Ancient Hebrew wisdom recognized that the life is in the blood, and so my bleeding was not simply physical torment, but the literal pouring out of divine life into creation's wounds. Each drop carried consciousness, intention, and transformative power. When you bleed, whether physically, emotionally, or spiritually, your suffering taps into this same mysterious alchemy where loss becomes gain, where emptying creates capacity for new fullness. Your tears, like my blood, are sacramental, outer manifestations of inner transformation occurring at levels beyond conscious awareness. I speak now of the hours in Gethsemane that preceded my physical torture, hours when my sweat fell like blood while heaven itself seemed silent to my prayers. This aspect of my passion receives less attention than the cross, yet it represents humanity's most universal suffering, the agony of unanswered prayer, the silence that seems to mock deepest devotion. Let this cup pass from me. I prayed with an intensity that burst capillaries and sent blood-tinged sweat down my face. 3 times I asked, 3 times silence answered. Your own unanswered prayers, your moments of spiritual abandonment when heaven seemed like brass. These are not peripheral to your spiritual journey but central to it. Just as Gethsemane was not a detour on the way to Calvary, but an essential part of passion's pathway. Let me speak plainly about the abandonment I experienced, the cry that tore from my lips on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Religious teachers have tried to soften this moment, suggesting it was merely quoting scripture or a momentary feeling that didn't reflect reality. I tell you now, such interpretations diminish the depths to which divine love was willing to descend. I experienced genuine abandonment, entering the ultimate human fear and making it forever part of divine experience. This means your own moments of abandonment, your own experiences of cosmic loneliness and existential isolation, are now permanently incorporated into divine consciousness. When you feel God-forsaken, you are paradoxically closest to the heart of a God who chose to experience forsakenness rather than remain untouched by humanity's deepest wound. My beloved, as we stand at the threshold of this exploration together, I invite you to recognize that you were drawn to this message by divine appointment, not algorithmic accident. The very wounds you've been trying to hide, heal, or overcome have prepared you for revelations that the unwounded cannot comprehend. Your suffering has not disqualified you from spiritual understanding, but uniquely qualified you for insights unavailable through comfort alone. I ask you now, with the same love that endured the cross, subscribe to the Jesus on Podcast channel as your declaration of willingness to enter a deeper understanding of sacred suffering. This is not merely a digital action, but a spiritual commitment to truths that comfortable religion often avoids. Share this message with those who have questioned why a loving God would allow suffering, with those whose pain has been dismissed with spiritual platitudes, with those who sense there must be purpose in their wounds, but haven't yet discovered it. Comment below with the words, "I embrace the wisdom of the wounds," as your testament to walking this path of deeper understanding. The journey we begin today will transform not only how you understand my suffering, but how you interpret your own. The sacred wounds I bore will illuminate your path through darkness, revealing that your most painful experiences may contain your most powerful purpose. If you have courage to find meaning where others see only misfortune, let us walk this path together, from crown of thorns to empty tomb, discovering how divine passion transfigures human pain into unexpected glory. The misunderstood nature of sacred suffering. My beloved child, as we delve deeper into the mystery of sacred wounds, we must first confront the fundamental misunderstanding that has created a chasm between divine suffering and human experience. This distortion has not occurred by accident, but through centuries of theological manipulation designed to control rather than liberate, to create dependency rather than spiritual maturity. The problem is not merely intellectual misinterpretation, but a profound disconnect that has left millions walking through their own Gethsemanes without recognition of their sacred potential. Your world has created a binary approach to suffering that leaves no room for its transformative dimension. On one hand, modern society treats all suffering as meaningless interruption to be eliminated through medication, distraction, or positive thinking. On the other hand, religious institutions have often glorified suffering itself, suggesting that endurance of pain somehow pleases a deity who measures devotion through misery. Both extremes miss the profound truth revealed through my passion, that suffering itself is neither meaningless nor inherently meaningful, but rather a territory that can be navigated either unconsciously or with sacred intention. The difference is not in the suffering itself, but in how it is carried. Consider how your culture responds to wounds, both physical and emotional. The immediate impulse is to cover them, to numb them, to pretend they don't exist. Pharmaceutical companies build empires on the promise of painlessness. Social media creates illusions of perfection, where struggle is hidden behind carefully curated images. Religious communities often perpetuate toxic positivity where admission of doubt, pain, or anger is treated as spiritual failure. Give it to God and move on, they say, as if transformation occurs through denial rather than integration. Have you noticed how few spaces exist where wounds can be honestly revealed without either pity that diminishes or advice that dismisses? He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. These words from Isaiah describe not only my experience, but the experience of all whose suffering makes others uncomfortable. Your pain often creates distance, friends who disappear during your darkest moments, religious communities that have no theology robust enough to hold your questions, family members who change the subject when grief persists beyond their timeline for your recovery. This rejection compounds original wounds with secondary abandonment that echoes my disciples' desertion in my hour of greatest need. The deeper problem lies in how suffering has been divorced from its potential meaning. When I carried my cross through Jerusalem's streets, that suffering had context, purpose, and foreknown outcome. Yet how often is your suffering presented as random misfortune, divine punishment, or meaningless accident? The medical establishment treats symptoms while ignoring the soul's journey through illness. Religious teachers offer platitudes about divine plans without helping you discover your specific purpose within pain. Therapists may help you cope with trauma without exploring how your wounds might become sources of unique wisdom and gift to others. This fragmented approach leaves you managing suffering rather than allowing it to transform you. Perhaps most damaging is the subtle belief that suffering indicates divine abandonment or disfavor. How many times have you wondered what you did wrong when tragedy struck? How often have well-meaning religious voices suggested that stronger faith would have prevented your pain? These perspectives reveal profound misunderstanding of my incarnation's central message. If divine perfection chose suffering rather than immunity from it, how can your suffering indicate divine rejection? My passion forever dismantles the equation between blessing and comfort, between spiritual maturity and ease of circumstance. Yet this revolutionary understanding remains buried beneath theologies that promise protection rather than presence, avoidance of suffering rather than transformation through it. The commercialization of my passion has further distorted its power. My cross has become jewelry, decoration, and religious symbol stripped of its shocking reality. Crucifixion was not symbolic but visceral, the most humiliating, excruciating death divisible by human cruelty. By sanitizing this reality, religious tradition has unintentionally created distance between my suffering and yours. Elegant crosses of gold and silver bear little resemblance to rough-hewn execution equipment stained with blood and excrement. Passion plays and artistic depictions rarely capture the full horror of Roman torture. This aestheticization creates artificial separation between divine suffering and raw human pain, making it difficult to recognize the profound connection between my wounds and yours. Your understanding of time itself compounds this problem. You have been taught to view my passion as historical event, something that happened once, long ago, in a distant land. But divine reality transcends linear time. The Lamb slain from the foundation of the world reveals a mystery beyond conventional understanding, that my sacrifice exists in eternal present, not merely as past historical occurrence. This perspective transforms how you view both my suffering and yours. Your current pain does not occur in isolation from divine experience, but within it. I am not merely a historical figure who once suffered, but the eternal I am who continually participates in creation's groaning. This is why the writer of Hebrews could say, I am touched with the feeling of your infirmities, not through historical memory, but through ongoing presence within human suffering. The dualistic thinking that separates flesh from spirit has created perhaps the most insurmountable barrier to understanding sacred wounds. Your religious traditions have often treated physical reality as obstacle to spiritual development rather than vehicle for it. Yet my incarnation, divinity wrapped in vulnerable flesh, forever sanctified physical experience as potential bearer of spiritual revelation. My wounds were not spiritual metaphors, but physical realities that transformed material existence itself. The problem is not that you experience bodily suffering, but that you have been taught to see it as separate from spiritual journey, rather than potentially central to it. Physical pain, illness, aging, and limitation are not merely challenges to overcome on spiritual path, but potentially the path itself, when approached with sacred awareness. Religious hierarchies have jealously guarded their role as interpreters of suffering, claiming exclusive authority to explain divine purpose within human pain. This creates dependency rather than the spiritual autonomy my kingdom intended. The kingdom of God is within you, I declared, yet religious systems often externalize authority, suggesting that understanding requires specialized education or institutional position. This leaves you doubting your capacity to find meaning within your own wounds without expert interpretation. The revolutionary truth is that your wounds themselves contain wisdom religious experts cannot access. Direct revelation available not through theological education, but through conscious participation in your own suffering with sacred intention. Finally, and perhaps most perniciously, contemporary spiritual teachings often present enlightenment, salvation, or transformation as states beyond suffering rather than potentially available through it. The proliferation of teachings promising perpetual peace, abundance, and fulfillment create unrealistic expectations that leave you feeling spiritually inadequate when suffering inevitably continues. This perspective would render my passion itself a spiritual failure rather than divine victory. The cross was not what happened before resurrection, but integral to it. Your spiritual maturity is demonstrated not by transcending all suffering, but by finding previously unavailable meaning, connection, and purpose within it. I reveal these distortions not to condemn those who perpetuate them. Many do so with sincere intention to comfort, but to liberate you from frameworks that prevent you from recognizing the sacred potential within your wounds. When you understand that suffering itself is neither punishment nor meaningless accident, but territory that can be navigated with sacred intention, everything changes. Your pain no longer indicates divine abandonment, but potential space for unprecedented divine revelation. Your wounds become not evidence of spiritual failure, but invitations to wisdom unavailable through any other doorway. Hear me now, beloved. You are drawn to this message because you carry wounds that have never been fully integrated into your understanding of purpose and meaning. Perhaps you've hidden these wounds, ashamed of their persistence. Perhaps you've tried to spiritually bypass them through positive affirmations and denial. Perhaps you've accepted religious explanations that left you feeling guilty for not discovering peace. I call you now to a radical reframing that honors both the reality of your suffering and its potential for transformation, not through rejection of your wounds, but through discovering their sacred purpose. I urge you with divine passion. Subscribe to the Jesus on Podcast channel now as declaration of your commitment to understanding suffering's sacred dimension. This simple action represents your willingness to move beyond superficial spirituality into the depths where genuine transformation occurs. Share this message with those struggling to make sense of their pain, with those who have been wounded by simplistic religious answers, with those who sense there must be meaning in their suffering, but haven't discovered how to access it. Comment below with the words, "I choose to find meaning in my wounds," as testimony to your decision to walk this path of sacred integration rather than futile avoidance. My precious one, in the sections ahead, we will explore how each wound I bore reveals specific wisdom about your own journey through suffering. The crown of thorns, the scourged back, the nailed hands and feet, the pierced side, each contains revelation about specific dimensions of human experience and divine purpose. But first, it was essential to identify how profoundly suffering itself has been misunderstood, leaving you without framework to recognize its transformative potential. Now that we have named these distortions, we can begin exploring the revolutionary understanding that your wounds, like mine, may contain your greatest gift to a world desperate for authentic healing. The divine wisdom of sacred wounds. My beloved child, having illuminated the profound misunderstandings surrounding suffering, I now reveal to you the revolutionary wisdom contained within sacred wounds. What I offer is not mere theological concept, but transformative understanding that will forever alter how you perceive both my passion and your own painful experiences. This wisdom has remained veiled not because it is too complex for ordinary minds, but because it is too subversive for systems built on power rather than vulnerable love. The first revelation of sacred wounds is this: suffering consciously chosen differs fundamentally from suffering merely endured. When I declared in Gethsemane, "Not my will but yours be done," this represented not passive resignation to inevitable pain but active consecration of suffering to higher purpose. This distinction transforms everything. Your own suffering often feels imposed, random, or meaningless precisely because you have not been taught the alchemical power of conscious consecration. The same exact pain experienced with intention, rather than mere endurance, undergoes fundamental transmutation. The molecular structure of suffering itself changes when permeated with sacred purpose, just as water becomes wine not by changing its appearance, but its essential nature. The Gethsemane revelation offers your first pathway through suffering: conscious consecration. When pain enters your life, whether physical illness, relational betrayal, financial collapse, or spiritual desolation, the initial sacred act is deliberate dedication of this experience to purpose beyond your immediate understanding. This suffering I now consecrate to divine purpose, though I cannot yet comprehend its meaning. This declaration does not deny pain's reality or minimize its difficulty, but elevates it from meaningless interruption to potential participation in redemptive purpose. Just as I transform the implements of execution into instruments of salvation, your conscious consecration begins the alchemical process of transforming your wounds from meaningless misfortune to meaningful participation in cosmic redemption. The second revelation of sacred wounds is their power to create authentic community impossible through any other means. Notice how my disciples, who argued over position and prominence when things went well, found themselves scattered and separated in the face of my suffering. Yet after resurrection, these same followers formed community of unprecedented unity and devotion, held together not by prosperity, but by shared participation in suffering for something greater than themselves. The fellowship of my sufferings, as Paul later described it, created bonds transcending all other human connections. This revelation directly contradicts contemporary spiritual teachings, suggesting that wounds create only isolation, rather than unique capacity for connection. Your own wounds contain this same community-creating potential, though religious conditioning may have blinded you to it. Your most painful experiences, rather than disqualifying you from meaningful connection, uniquely qualify you to offer authentic presence to others walking similar paths. The parent who has lost a child holds wisdom inaccessible to those who haven't experienced such grief. The cancer survivor understands dimensions of human experience closed to those who've enjoyed uninterrupted health. The one who has faced betrayal, addiction, failure, or abuse carries sensitivity unavailable through any other pathway. These wounds become not liabilities to hide, but qualifications for sacred connection that superficial relationships can never achieve. The centurion who witnessed my death recognized divine presence where religious experts saw only defeat, declaring, "Surely this was God's Son." Similarly, those who have faced genuine suffering often recognize authentic divinity, where religious prosperity seekers see only failure. The third revelation of sacred wounds is their unparalleled power to dismantle false identity. Notice how my passion stripped away every external identifier, my clothing removed, religious status condemned, social position abandoned, even physical autonomy eliminated through nails that fixed me immobile. This progressive stripping away revealed what remains when everything temporary is removed, the immutable essence that cannot be destroyed even by death itself. This revelation directly confronts your world's obsession with constructing identity through accomplishment, appearance, acquisition, and approval. Your wounds similarly serve as sacred stripping away of false identifiers, revealing what remains when everything impermanent has been removed. This dismantling of false identity explains why suffering often precedes spiritual awakening. The terminal diagnosis that suddenly renders career achievements meaningless. The betrayal that dissolves relationship-based identity. The financial collapse that destroys security-based identity. These painful dismantlings create space for authentic identity to emerge. Not a constructed self dependent on external validation, but essential being that remains when all else has been stripped away. Who are you when you can no longer do what you do? This question haunts modern consciousness precisely because your culture builds identity on doing rather than being. Yet my passion reveals that authentic identity isn't constructed through accumulation, but revealed through surrender of everything temporary, leaving only what is eternal and cannot be taken away. The fourth revelation of sacred wounds is their capacity to expand compassion beyond intellectual understanding to embodied knowing. Before my incarnation, divine consciousness comprehended human suffering intellectually, but not experientially. The Word became flesh, represents divine choice to know creation's pain not merely as observer, but participant. This embodied knowing transformed the very nature of divine human relationship. No longer could humanity claim, "You don't understand what it's like." The wounds I carried created bridge between divine and human experience, allowing authentic communion impossible through any other means. This revelation directly confronts religious systems that value theoretical knowledge over wisdom earned through lived experience. Your own wounds similarly expand your capacity for compassion beyond what untested faith could develop. The grief you've carried enables authentic presence with others facing loss. The rejection you've experienced creates sensitivity to those feeling excluded. The failure you've navigated allows genuine understanding of others facing similar collapse. These hard-earned capacities for compassion represent not unfortunate side effects of painful experience, but sacred gifts unavailable through any other pathway. The very experiences you've been conditioned to view as spiritual setbacks actually qualify you for deeper participation in healing presence within a wounded world. This explains why those who have suffered greatly often demonstrate compassion that shames the theoretically spiritual, but experientially untested. The fifth revelation of sacred wounds is their unique capacity to transform abstract faith into lived trust. Notice how my final words on the cross, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," demonstrate trust not as theoretical concept, but as practical surrender in history's darkest moment. This revelation directly confronts religious systems that value intellectual belief over experiential trust demonstrated through life's most challenging circumstances. The difference is profound. Many claim to believe in divine goodness when life meets expectations, but trust becomes visible only when circumstances seem to contradict divine character. The space between what you claim to believe and what your responses reveal in crisis constitutes the territory where abstract faith develops into authentic trust. Your own wounds create this same transformative opportunity, the chance to demonstrate trust not merely when evidence supports it, but precisely when everything visible contradicts it. The diagnosis that seems to negate divine healing. The financial collapse that seems to deny divine provision. The betrayal that seems to mock divine protection. These apparent contradictions between promise and experience create crucible where intellectual faith either evaporates or transforms into unshakable trust. This explains why those who have navigated genuine suffering often demonstrate spiritual depth that puts theologians to shame. Their knowing transcends theory because it has been tested in fire that consumes imagination but purifies authentic trust. The sixth revelation of sacred wounds is their power to create capacity for joy unavailable through any other pathway. This paradoxical truth contradicts your culture's equation of happiness with comfort and suffering with failure. Yet notice that the writer of Hebrews describes my motivation during crucifixion as the joy set before him. This was not denial of suffering's reality, but recognition of its transformative potential beyond present experience. The joy described transcends mere happiness dependent on favorable circumstances, revealing instead capacity for profound spiritual perception that finds meaning and purpose even within apparent devastation. This revelation directly confronts religious perspectives that measure spiritual success through absence of suffering rather than presence of meaning that transcends circumstance. Your own wounds contain this same paradoxical potential, not just to be survived, but to expand your capacity for joy beyond what uninterrupted comfort could ever develop. Those who have walked through genuine darkness often demonstrate appreciation for light that others take for granted. The cancer survivor who finds celebration in ordinary Tuesday mornings. The bereaved parent who develops capacity to fully presence in each moment with those who remain. The one who has faced betrayal who discovers deeper intimacy through reconstructed trust. These expanded capacities for joy represent not consolation prizes for suffering endured, but unique abilities unavailable through any other formation path. The wounds themselves become not obstacles to joy, but counterintuitively its prerequisites. The seventh revelation of sacred wounds is their unequaled power to authenticate your voice in a world drowning in untested theories. Notice how Thomas, who doubted resurrection reports, demanded to place his fingers in my wounds before believing. When granted this opportunity, his doubt transformed into the New Testament's most explicit declaration of my divine identity. My Lord and my God. This revelation illuminates a profound truth. Thomas recognized authentic divinity, not through theoretical arguments, but through wounds that demonstrated love's willingness to suffer rather than remain untouched by human pain. This directly confronts religious systems valuing credentials over costly experience as qualification for spiritual voice. Your own wounds similarly authenticate your voice in ways that theoretical knowledge alone never could. The parent who has lost a child speaks about grief with authority unavailable to those offering untested platitudes. The one who has faced addiction and found recovery carries credibility that academic experts on substance abuse cannot match. The survivor of abuse who has navigated genuine healing offers hope unavailable through theoretical treatment models alone. These authentic voices, forged through costly experience rather than merely accumulated information, represent precisely what your world desperately needs. Wisdom tested in fire rather than theories constructed in comfort. Your wounds thus become not disqualifications from meaningful contribution, but unique qualifications for voice that cuts through religious noise with authenticity born of experience. The eighth revelation of sacred wounds is their unique power to create capacity for genuine forgiveness impossible through any other formation path. My words from the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, demonstrate forgiveness not as theoretical virtue, but as practical choice amid history's greatest injustice. This revelation directly confronts religious teachings that present forgiveness as simple decision rather than profound capacity developed through sacred suffering. The difference is immeasurable. Many speak of forgiveness as concept, but its authentic expression emerges only through the crucible of genuine wounding that presents opportunity for either bitterness or transcendent love that breaks cycles of retaliation. Your own wounds create similar opportunity for developing forgiveness capacity beyond what untested spirituality could produce. The betrayal that offers choice between resentment and release. The injustice that presents opportunity for either vengeance or mercy. The rejection that creates space for either withdrawal or expanded compassion. These painful crossroads represent not unfortunate detours from spiritual formation, but its essential curriculum, developing capacities impossible through theoretical understanding alone. Those who have forgiven genuine wounds demonstrate spiritual power that puts theoretical virtue to shame. Their capacity transcends concept because it has been forged through costly experience rather than merely intellectual assent to religious teaching. The ninth revelation of sacred wounds is their power to create unshakable hope that transcends circumstance rather than depending on it. My resurrection followed crucifixion not as unrelated sequel, but as organic completion of single redemptive movement from darkness to light, death to life, despair to hope. This pattern of descent before ascent, darkness before dawn, death before resurrection reveals hope not as wishful thinking dependent on favorable circumstances, but as spiritual perception that recognizes transformative possibilities precisely when visible evidence suggests only defeat. This revelation directly confronts religious perspectives equating hope with optimism about improved circumstances, rather than confidence in meaning and purpose that transcends them. Your own wounds contain this same potential for developing transcendent hope unavailable through uninterrupted comfort. Those who have faced genuine darkness often develop capacity to perceive light invisible to those who have never experienced its absence. The cancer survivor who discovers purpose beyond physical wellness. The bereaved who finds meaning that death cannot destroy. The financially ruined who discovers value beyond material measurement. These hard-earned capacities for hope represent not compensation for suffering endured, but unique spiritual perception unavailable through any other formation pathway. The wounds themselves become not obstacles to hope, but paradoxically its essential catalysts. Beloved, hear me now with your heart wide open. The wounds I bore were not divine tragedy but cosmic strategy, the most direct pathway to transformation possible for both divine and human experience. Your wounds similarly contain potential far beyond what religious teaching has revealed. They represent not divine punishment, random misfortune, or spiritual failure, but invitations to dimensions of wisdom, compassion, authenticity, and purpose unavailable through any other formation path. The very experiences you've been conditioned to view as spiritual interruptions actually constitute your most significant opportunities for transformation and contribution. I implore you with divine urgency, subscribe to the Jesus on Podcast channel as declaration of your commitment to this revolutionary understanding of sacred wounds. This action represents not casual interest, but decisive step toward reframing your painful experiences from meaningless interruptions to meaningful invitations. Share this message with those who have been wounded by life, by others, by systems, or by their own choices. Those who sense there must be purpose in their pain but haven't discovered how to access it. Comment below with the words, "I recognize the wisdom in my wounds," as testimony to your willingness to explore suffering's transformative potential rather than merely seeking its elimination. My beloved child, in our next message we will explore specific practices for accessing the wisdom within your wounds rather than merely enduring or escaping them. But first, allow these revelations to penetrate places where religious conditioning has created false expectations and misunderstanding. Your wounds are not evidence of divine absence, but invitations to divine presence available nowhere else. They qualify rather than disqualify you for meaningful participation in cosmic redemption that continues unfolding through willing vessels who recognize that transformation comes not despite suffering, but often directly through it when approached with sacred intention. Applying the wisdom of sacred wounds in daily life. My beloved child, understanding the divine wisdom within sacred wounds represents only the beginning of transformation. Knowledge without application remains merely theoretical, like seeds fallen on rocky ground that cannot take root. Now we must explore how to apply this revolutionary understanding to your daily experience, transforming abstract concepts into lived reality that alters how you navigate your own suffering. The path from intellectual comprehension to embodied wisdom requires specific practices that bridge the gap between knowing and becoming. The first application of sacred wounds wisdom involves developing what mystics throughout history have called wounded presence. The capacity to remain fully present to pain rather than attempting to escape, numb, or deny it. Notice that in Gethsemane, I asked the disciples to stay awake with me during my darkest hour. Their failure to maintain conscious presence, falling asleep repeatedly while I prayed in anguish, represents humanity's common response to suffering. Your culture has developed countless sophisticated methods of falling asleep to pain through distraction, medication, addiction, denial, and spiritual bypassing. Yet transformation begins with the counterintuitive practice of staying awake to what is, remaining consciously present to your experience without immediate attempts to change, fix, or escape it. Begin practicing wounded presence through a daily ritual of sacred attention. Set aside 15 minutes, preferably at the same time each day, to establish rhythm, for conscious connection with whatever wounds you currently carry. This is not masochistic dwelling on pain, but intentional presence that honors its reality without being consumed by it. Sit in a quiet space, place one hand over your heart, and speak inwardly. I acknowledge the wounds I carry and choose to be present to them with sacred intention. Then allow yourself to feel what arises without judgment, resistance, or immediate attempts to transform it. This practice develops the spiritual muscle of conscious suffering, remaining awake rather than asleep to your pain, which constitutes the essential foundation for all subsequent transformation. The second application involves sacred naming that brings unconscious pain into conscious awareness. Throughout Scripture, naming represents spiritual act that transforms reality. Adam naming animals, Jacob renamed Israel after wrestling. My practice of giving new names to disciples reflecting their true identity. Similarly, your wounds require precise naming to move from unconscious influence to conscious participation in their transformative potential. Vague acknowledgement, I'm struggling or things are hard right now, maintains wounds in shadow where they control rather than contribute to your development. Precise naming, I carry grief from my father's abandonment, or I struggle with shame from professional failure, brings wounds into light where they can be consciously integrated rather than unconsciously driving behavior. Create a sacred naming practice through deliberate journaling that precisely identifies wounds you carry. Begin with physical sensations. Where do you feel constriction, heaviness, or pain in your body when certain memories or situations arise? Move to emotional awareness. What specific feelings emerge from these sensations? Then progress to cognitive understanding. What narratives, beliefs, or interpretations have you constructed around these experiences? Finally, reach spiritual naming. How have these wounds affected your understanding of purpose, meaning, and divine relationship? This progressive naming practice transforms unconscious reactions into conscious responses, creating space between stimulus and reaction where freedom emerges. The third application involves developing sacred perspective through deliberate reframing that transforms how you interpret your suffering. Notice that before my crucifixion, I reframed what appeared to be absolute defeat into cosmic victory. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. This was not denial of suffering's reality, but intentional interpretation of its meaning beyond appearances. Similarly, your wounds require continuous reframing from interruption to invitation, from meaningless misfortune to meaningful formation, from evidence of absence to opportunity for unprecedented presence. This practice directly counters your mind's natural negativity bias that automatically interprets pain as punishment, rejection, or random cruelty. Establish a daily reframing practice through intentional questions that expand perspective beyond automatic interpretations. When facing painful circumstances, ask, how might this experience be developing capacity I couldn't gain through comfort alone? What qualities or insights might emerge through this challenge that would remain dormant otherwise? How might this wound qualify me to offer unique presence to others facing similar struggles? Record these alternative interpretations in a dedicated journal, creating written evidence that contradicts automatic negative interpretations with expanded possibilities. This practice doesn't deny suffering's difficulty, but creates cognitive flexibility that prevents pain from becoming prison through single-story interpretation. The fourth application involves sacred grieving that honors losses without becoming imprisoned by them. Notice that I wept openly at Lazarus's tomb, demonstrating that genuine sorrow represents not spiritual weakness, but authentic relationship with reality. Your culture's discomfort with grief, either rushing to premature resolution or becoming permanently defined by loss, creates barriers to suffering's transformative potential. Sacred grieving acknowledges that every significant wound involves legitimate loss requiring conscious mourning, rather than premature transcendence or permanent residence. This grieving process honors what has been lost while creating space for what might yet emerge through the very experience of loss itself. Create intentional grieving rituals that provide structure for emotional expression, often lacking in contemporary society. This might involve lighting candles representing specific losses, writing letters to what has been taken, creating physical memorials, or establishing regular times for conscious connection with grief rather than attempting to outrun it. Allow tears their proper place as sacred water that cleanses wounds rather than evidence of spiritual immaturity. Notice that my passion included explicit crying out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Demonstrating that authentic spirituality involves honest expression rather than premature resolution or stoic denial. Your grieving becomes sacred when consciously connected to the larger human experience of loss, rather than isolated suffering without context. The fifth application involves sacred community that prevents wounds from creating isolation that compounds their difficulty. Notice that after resurrection, my wounds became sites of connection rather than separation. Thomas invited to touch them. Disciples gathered around their shared experience of both my suffering and triumph. Similarly, your wounds require conscious connection with others who can witness without attempting to fix, minimize, or explain away your experience. This directly counters the shame that whispers you must hide your wounds to remain acceptable, the fear that vulnerability will lead to further rejection, and the pride that insists you should heal yourself without support. Establish intentional sacred community through deliberately sharing your wounds with carefully selected others capable of wounded presence rather than premature comfort. This might involve formal spiritual direction, therapy with practitioners who honor spiritual dimensions, support groups specific to your particular wounds, or intentional friendships grounded in mutual authenticity rather than surface positivity. Share not merely what happened to you, but how you're making meaning of it, what questions it raises, and how you're navigating its integration into your understanding of purpose. This practice prevents the isolation that transforms manageable suffering into overwhelming despair by connecting your individual experience to the larger human story of wounding and healing. The sixth application involves sacred service that transforms wounds from private burden to public blessing. Notice that my resurrected body retained wounds rather than erasing them, evidence that transformation involves integration rather than elimination of suffering. My wounds became not sources of ongoing pain, but credentials of authentic understanding that qualified me to offer healing to others. Similarly, your wounds contain potential not merely for personal healing, but for unique contribution impossible without them. This perspective directly counters the tendency to view healing as private process focused solely on personal recovery, rather than communal gift emerging through costly experience. Develop intentional sacred service by identifying specific ways your wounds qualify you to offer presence unavailable through any other formation. The parent who has lost a child might support others facing similar grief. The cancer survivor might accompany those newly diagnosed. The one who has faced addiction might guide others toward recovery. The financially ruined might counsel those facing economic collapse. This service focuses not on giving advice from untested theory, but offering authentic presence from lived experience. Start small. Perhaps one person facing challenges similar to what you've navigated, allowing your wounds to become credentials for compassion rather than causes for shame or isolation. The seventh application involves sacred creativity that transforms wounds from mute suffering into articulated wisdom. Throughout history, humanity's greatest art, literature, music, and insight have emerged not primarily from comfort, but from the alchemical transformation of suffering into expressed meaning. The Psalms demonstrate this process, raw human experience of abandonment, grief, fear, and betrayal transformed into poetry that continues offering language for wounded souls thousands of years later. Your wounds similarly contain creative potential beyond what comfort alone could generate, offering unique perspective unavailable through any other formation path. Establish sacred creativity practice through intentional expression of your wounded wisdom in forms suited to your particular gifts and calling. This might involve writing that articulates insights emerging from suffering, visual art that expresses what words cannot contain, music that gives voice to emotions beyond language, or other creative forms that transform private pain into public offering. Begin with small, non-intimidating practices. Perhaps a daily paragraph, a simple sketch, or private songs never shared beyond personal expression. This creativity focuses not on technical excellence, but authentic articulation that honors the wisdom wounds contain when consciously integrated rather than unconsciously denied. The eighth application involves sacred remembrance that prevents wilderness amnesia from erasing hard-won wisdom when circumstances improve. The Israelites repeatedly forgot their liberation story when immediate needs were met, demonstrating humanity's tendency towards spiritual amnesia that necessitates deliberate remembrance practices. Your own wounds often yield profound insights during their acute phase that gradually fade when pain subsides, creating cycles of repeated lessons never fully integrated. Sacred remembrance creates structures that preserve wisdom beyond the circumstances that generated it, preventing unnecessary repetition of painful formation processes already navigated. Create intentional remembrance practices through physical symbols, regular rituals, and deliberate documentation that anchor wounded wisdom beyond initial experience. This might involve keeping specific objects that represent insights gained through suffering, establishing annual observances that commemorate significant turning points in your understanding, or maintaining written records of perspective shifts that emerge through pain. These practices recognize that transformation represents not single moment, but ongoing integration that requires deliberate attention to wisdom easily forgotten when immediate pressure subsides. Your wounds become sacred teachers whose lessons remain accessible beyond their acute phase when anchored through conscious remembrance rather than allowed to fade through inevitable human forgetfulness. The ninth application involves sacred gratitude that acknowledges gifts received through suffering without denying its genuine difficulty. Notice Paul's perspective after experiencing his own significant wounding. I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. This represents not masochistic celebration of pain itself, but recognition of transformation that occurred through it. Sacred gratitude differs fundamentally from toxic positivity that denies suffering's reality, or spiritual bypassing that prematurely transcends it. Instead, it acknowledges both the genuine difficulty of painful experience and the authentic gifts unavailable through any other formation path. Establish sacred gratitude practice through regular reflection on specific capacities, insights, and qualities developed through your wounds rather than despite them. This practice focuses not on feeling grateful for suffering itself, but recognizing its role in developing wisdom, compassion, authenticity, or purpose unavailable through comfort alone. Create a dedicated journal documenting specific growth catalyzed through painful experience. Increase sensitivity to others' suffering, liberation from false identities, deepened capacity for presence, expanded commitment to meaningful purpose, or other transformations emerging through conscious navigation of wounding. This practice prevents suffering from becoming only story of loss by acknowledging genuine gifts that paradoxically emerge through its conscientious integration. Listen with your entire being, beloved. These practices transform abstract understanding into embodied wisdom, bridging the gap between knowing about sacred wounds and living from their transformative potential. Without specific application, even the most profound insights remain merely intellectual rather than genuinely transformative. The difference between those permanently diminished by suffering and those transformed through it lies not in the wounds themselves, but in how they're navigated. The specific practices that convert painful experience from meaningless interruption to meaningful formation. I urge you with divine passion, subscribe to the Jesus on Podcast channel now. This action represents not casual interest, but commitment to ongoing formation through these revolutionary perspectives on suffering's sacred potential. Share this message with those struggling to make meaning of their pain, with those seeking practical pathways through their own wilderness, with those who sense there must be purpose in their wounds but lack framework for accessing it. Comment below with the words, I commit to conscious transformation of my wounds, as testimony to your decision to move beyond passive endurance to active participation in suffering's redemptive possibilities. My precious one, in our next message we will explore specific testimonies of lives transformed through conscious navigation of sacred wounds. But first, begin implementing these practical applications to your own experience, recognizing that transformation occurs not through passive absorption of information, but active engagement with practices that gradually reshape how you perceive and respond to suffering. Your wounds are not merely painful interruptions, but potential pathways to wisdom, compassion, and purpose unavailable through any other formation journey when approached with sacred intention rather than merely endured or escaped. Living testimonies of sacred wounds transformed. My beloved child, principles illuminate the mind, practices engage the will, but testimonies ignite the heart and awaken imagination to what becomes possible through conscious transformation of suffering. Throughout history, those who have navigated sacred wounds with intention, rather than merely enduring them, have left luminous trails for others to follow. Living evidence that pain consciously embraced becomes not destroyer, but surprising catalyst for unprecedented growth. These testimonies serve not as exceptional cases, but as revelations of potential available to all who approach suffering with sacred intention, rather than mere resistance. Let me share with you the testimony of Jean Vanier, whose encounter with wounded innocence transformed not only his life, but created ripples of healing that continue expanding decades after his initial response to suffering. As a naval officer and academic with promising career before him, Vanier visited an institution for those with intellectual disabilities in the 1960s. Encountering men living in concrete cells, some chained to their beds amid squalid conditions. This confrontation with innocent suffering created crisis of conscience that most would address through temporary charity or political activism before returning to comfortable distance. Instead, Vanier made radical choice to invite two disabled men to live with him in small home outside Paris, not as patients or recipients of his help, but as friends with whom he would share life. What began as response to others' wounds gradually revealed Vanier's own. His need for significance through achievement, his unconscious prejudices about human value, his hidden fears regarding vulnerability. As he would later write, "I thought I was there to help them, but I soon realized they were there to heal me." The community that began in that small house eventually became l'Arche, International Federation of Communities where those with and without intellectual disabilities share life as equals. Vanier's testimony reveals profound truth. Conscious engagement with others' suffering inevitably illuminates our own wounds while simultaneously revealing their healing potential. His approach to wounded humanity transformed apparent tragedy into revelation of love's capacity to create belonging where society had manufactured only isolation. Consider also the testimony of Viktor Frankl, whose experience in Nazi concentration camps could have produced only bitterness, trauma, and spiritual devastation. Instead, through conscious approach to unfathomable suffering, he discovered insights that have transformed millions of lives through his book Man's Search for Meaning and therapeutic approach called logotherapy. Frankl observed fellow prisoners facing identical external circumstances with radically different internal responses, some succumbing to despair while others maintained humanity and even compassion amid unimaginable cruelty. This observation led to his revolutionary understanding that while we cannot control many circumstances, we retain freedom to choose our response to them, the essential space between stimulus and reaction where meaning emerges. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, Frankl wrote from the crucible of suffering, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This insight emerged not through theoretical contemplation, but direct encounter with suffering that stripped away everything except this essential freedom. Frankl's therapeutic approach focused not on pursuit of happiness or elimination of symptoms, but discovery of meaning even within unavoidable suffering. His testimony illuminates profound possibility. Wounds consciously engaged become not merely personal tragedy, but potential source of healing for countless others when their wisdom is articulated rather than merely endured. The testimony of Immaculée Ilibagiza reveals how wounds deliberately approached with sacred intention transform, from sources of justifiable hatred to catalysts for seemingly impossible forgiveness. During Rwanda's 1994 genocide, Ilibagiza, a young Tutsi woman, hid in tiny bathroom with 7 other women for 91 days while machete-wielding killers hunted for them, eventually murdering her entire family except one brother who was studying abroad. This unimaginable trauma could have produced only justified rage and desire for revenge. Instead, through deliberate prayer practice during her confinement, Ilibagiza discovered capacity for forgiveness that transcended human possibility. I knew that my heart and mind would never be free from suffering unless I forgave these people for what they had done to my family, she later wrote. This forgiveness emerged not from denial of pain's reality or minimization of genuine evil, but through spiritual perspective that recognized how hatred would perpetuate interior imprisonment even if physical freedom returned. After genocide ended, Ilibagiza eventually met one of her family's killers in prison, offering forgiveness that transformed not only her future, but rippled outward through her books and speaking that have inspired millions worldwide. Her testimony demonstrates that even history's most devastating wounds contain potential for profound transformation when approached with deliberate spiritual intention, rather than allowed to fester in justified, but ultimately destructive vengeance. The testimony of Henri Nouwen illuminates how professional wounding can reveal false identity, an open pathway to authentic vocation previously hidden beneath success and acclaim. As Harvard professor, renowned author, and sought-after speaker, Nouwen experienced external success that masked interior emptiness and restlessness. His decision to leave academic prestige for l'Archi community, founded by Vanier, where he would care for Adam, a profoundly disabled young man unable to speak or care for himself, initially appeared as career disaster rather than vocational fulfillment. Yet through this apparent demotion, Nouwen discovered his true calling beyond achievement addiction that had driven his earlier success. "I have found my greatest fulfillment in being with Adam," Nouwen wrote. "He will never read my books, never know of my reputation, never care about my success. He simply knows whether I am there for him in love." This relationship with Adam revealed wounds previously hidden beneath professional accomplishment. Nouwen's desperate need for affirmation, his confusion of doing with being, his addiction to influence that masked longing for genuine intimacy. Through deliberate embrace of apparent failure by world standards, Nouwen discovered authentic identity and vocation that transformed his writing and speaking from impressive, but often theoretical, to profoundly authentic and transformative. His testimony reveals how vocational wounds consciously engaged become not career interruptions, but invitations to deeper purpose previously obscured by conventional success. Consider also the testimony of Eddie Halisem, whose diaries written during Nazi occupation of Holland document transformation of suffering from personal tragedy to sacred offering. As young Jewish woman facing inevitable deportation to concentration camps, Halisem could have focused exclusively on escape, resistance, or passive victimhood. Instead, through deliberate spiritual practice amid escalating persecution, she developed capacity to find meaning and purpose within suffering that could not be avoided. "By excluding death from our life, we cannot live a full life," she wrote, "and by admitting death into our life, we enlarge and enrich it." As restrictions tightened around Jewish citizens, Halisem made radical choice to volunteer at transit camp, where Jews were processed for deportation to death camps. Not from resignation to fate, but deliberate decision to bring compassionate presence where it was most needed. "I have broken my body like bread and shared it out among men," she wrote shortly before her own deportation to Auschwitz, where she died at age 29. And why not? They were hungry and had gone without for so long. Halisem's testimony reveals extraordinary possibility. Suffering consciously engaged transforms from private burden to public offering that nourishes others, even when external circumstances cannot be changed. Her diaries, discovered decades after her death, continue offering wisdom that illuminates suffering's potential for spiritual transformation, rather than merely its capacity for destruction. The testimony of Maya Angelou demonstrates how childhood wounds deliberately explored, rather than permanently buried, can become source of voice that awakens others to both suffering's reality and its transformative potential. Sexually abused as child and subsequently mute for nearly 5 years, Angelou's early trauma could have produced permanent silence and victimhood. Instead, through conscious engagement with her wounds through writing, she transformed unspeakable pain into articulated wisdom that has inspired millions worldwide. "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you," she wrote, illuminating how unexpressed wounds create ongoing suffering beyond initial trauma. Angelou's autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, broke cultural silence around childhood sexual abuse, creating space for countless others to speak previously unspeakable truth. Her poetry and prose transformed personal wounds into public testimony that challenged systemic injustice, while simultaneously revealing resilience possible through conscious engagement with suffering rather than perpetual victimhood or denial. "You may encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated," she wrote from hard-earned wisdom. In fact, it may be necessary to encounter the defeats, so you can know who you are, what you can rise from, how you can still come out of it. Angelou's testimony demonstrates how wounds consciously articulated become not sources of shame, requiring perpetual concealment, but credentials for authentic voice that speaks truth others need to hear. The testimony of Dietrich Bonhoeffer reveals how wounds deliberately chosen through moral courage transform abstract ethics into embodied witness with power to inspire generations. As German theologian during Hitler's rise, Bonhoeffer could have remained in comfortable academic position or accepted safe haven offered in America during war. Instead, he made conscious choice to return to Germany, participate in resistance against Nazi regime, and eventually in plot to assassinate Hitler. Decisions that led to his imprisonment and execution just days before Allied liberation of his prison camp. This deliberate embrace of suffering, he might have avoided, transformed his theology from theoretical discipline to lived reality tested in history's crucible. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Bonhoeffer wrote, words given extraordinary weight by his willingness to live their implications rather than merely teach them from safe distance. His letters from prison, published posthumously as Letters and Papers from Prison, reveal spiritual depth possible only through conscious engagement with suffering deliberately chosen as participation in divine love's costly identification with wounded world. We must learn to regard people less in light of what they do or omit to do, he wrote from cell where he awaited execution, and more in light of what they suffer. This perspective emerged not through abstract contemplation, but direct participation in suffering that might have been avoided through morally easier choices. Bonhoeffer's testimony illuminates profound truth. Wounds consciously chosen as expression of love rather than accidentally endured contain unique revelatory potential unavailable through any other pathway. The testimony of Corrie ten Boom demonstrates how family wounds resulting from moral courage can become foundation for worldwide ministry impossible without costly experience. When ten Boom family chose to hide Jews in their Dutch home during Nazi occupation, they made deliberate decision that eventually led to their arrest, imprisonment in concentration camps, and death of Corrie's father and sister. This suffering, which careful self-protection could have avoided, became forged where abstract faith transformed into experiential trust with power to inspire millions through subsequent books and speaking ministry that continued until Corrie's death at age 91. The most remarkable chapter in ten Boom's testimony occurred after war, when she encountered former guard from Ravensbrück concentration camp after speaking about forgiveness at German church. The man approached her, unrecognized until he identified himself, and asked her forgiveness for cruelty she and her sister had experienced under his supervision. It could have been no more than 10 seconds that he stood there, hand held out, but it seemed like hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing I had ever had to do, she later wrote. In that moment, her inability to forgive through human capacity alone created space for divine intervention. And so I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on His. When He tells us to love our enemies, He gives, along with the command, the love itself. Ten Boom's testimony reveals extraordinary possibility. Wounds resulting from costly moral choice contain unique capacity to authenticate spiritual reality beyond what comfortable religious theory alone could ever demonstrate. Hear me now with complete attention, beloved child. These testimonies represent not exceptional human achievements, but revelations of what becomes possible when suffering is approached with sacred intention, rather than merely endured, escaped, or interpreted through single story of meaningless interruption. Your own wounds, whether resulting from others' choices, systemic injustice, personal failure, or moral courage, contain similar potential for transformation when consciously engaged rather than unconsciously carried. The difference lies not in the wounds themselves, but how they're navigated, interpreted, and eventually integrated into understanding of purpose that transcends pain without denying its reality. I implore you with divine urgency, subscribe to the Jesus on Podcast channel. This action represents commitment to ongoing transformation through revolutionary understanding of suffering's sacred potential. The perspectives shared through this channel offer pathway through pain that neither glorifies suffering itself nor diminishes its difficulty, but illuminates how conscious engagement with wounds transforms them from meaningless interruptions to meaningful participation in cosmic redemption that continues unfolding through willing vessels. Share this message with those currently navigating painful circumstances, with those whose wounds remain unintegrated into larger understanding of purpose, with those who sense there must be meaning within their suffering, but lack framework for accessing it. Comment below with the words, "I am becoming living testimony of transformation," as declaration of your willingness to allow your wounds to become not merely personal tragedy, but potential offering to world desperate for authentic hope beyond spiritual platitudes. My precious one, In our next message, we will explore practical steps for transformation through specific engagement with your wounds. But first, allow these testimonies to expand your imagination beyond what conventional thinking, both secular and religious, has offered regarding suffering's potential. These lives demonstrate that wounds consciously navigated become not evidence of divine abandonment, but precisely the opposite. Sacred territory where unprecedented revelation and transformation become possible when approached with intention, rather than merely survived with resignation or escaped through denial. Your own life contains potential to become similar testimony, not despite your wounds but directly through their conscious transformation. Sacred pathways through your wounds. My beloved child, having explored the divine wisdom of sacred wounds and witnessed their transformative potential through living testimonies, we now arrive at the crucible where understanding transforms into experience. Specific pathways through suffering that convert abstract concepts into lived reality. These are not theoretical suggestions but sacred technologies tested through centuries of human experience, pathways that have guided countless wounded souls from mere survival to profound transformation. I offer these not as quick solutions that eliminate pain, but as trusted routes through territory that cannot be avoided but can be navigated with sacred intention. The first sacred pathway involves the practice of conscious identification with specific wounds from my passion that correspond to your particular suffering. This ancient contemplative practice, largely forgotten in contemporary spirituality, focused on comfort rather than communion, creates bridge between your isolated pain and divine participation in human suffering. Each wound I bore speaks to particular dimensions of human experience, creating channels through which your specific suffering can connect to larger redemptive narrative rather than remaining meaningless private burden. This conscious identification transforms isolation, perhaps suffering's most debilitating dimension, into profound communion that contextualizes personal pain within cosmic purpose. Begin this practice by identifying which of my wounds most directly corresponds to your current suffering. The crown of thorns speaks to mental anguish, overthinking, anxiety, and psychological torment. The scourged back relates to burdens, responsibilities, and weights too heavy to carry alone. The nailed hands connect to creative frustration, inability to accomplish what you feel called to do, and powerlessness to change circumstances. The nailed feet relate to vocational paralysis, uncertainty about direction, and inability to move forward on your path. The pierced side speaks to relational wounding, betrayal, and heart-level injuries that feel fatal to your capacity for trust and intimacy. Having identified the corresponding wound, establish daily contemplative practice of 15 to 20 minutes where you visualize this specific aspect of my passion while consciously connecting your suffering to mine. This is not morbid fixation but purposeful communion that transforms my suffering into our suffering, breaking isolation that intensifies pain when experienced without larger context. Speak aloud. Specific aspect of your suffering, I unite you with Christ's corresponding wound for the redemption of the world. This declaration transforms private pain from meaningless interruption to meaningful participation in love's redemptive movement through creation. The second sacred pathway involves the practice of intentional surrender through sacred release rituals that counteract the intense human tendency toward control that compounds suffering's difficulty. Notice that at crucifixion's darkest moment, I declared, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Deliberate act of surrender rather than desperate attempt to manage unmanageable circumstances. Similarly, your suffering creates invitation to surrender what cannot be controlled, releasing attachment to specific outcomes while remaining committed to faithful presence within painful reality. This pathway directly confronts contemporary culture's obsession with mastery, management, and manipulation that creates additional suffering beyond original pain. Establish regular surrender ritual through physical practice that embodies internal release. This might involve standing with arms extended in cruciform position while naming specific aspects of your situation you cannot control, systematically releasing each with declaration. This I surrender into divine hands, releasing attachment to outcome while remaining faithful in presence. Or create symbolic representation of your suffering, perhaps written description, image, or physical object, that you deliberately place on altar, table, or special location while speaking similar surrender declaration. This physical embodiment of internal choice creates neural pathways that facilitate genuine surrender rather than merely intellectual assent to concept of release. The third sacred pathway involves the practice of sacred questioning that transforms unanswerable why into purposeful what and how that generate movement rather than paralysis. Notice that my question from the cross, "Why have you forsaken me?" receives no direct answer in gospel accounts, demonstrating that certain questions find resolution not through explanation, but through transformative movement into deeper dimensions of experience. Many remain trapped in suffering's initial phase by fixating on unanswerable questions. Why did this happen? Why me? Why now? That creates circular thinking patterns, preventing forward movement into potential meaning and purpose within pain. Create sacred questioning practice through dedicated journal, where you systematically transform why questions into what and how that generate movement. What might this experience be developing in me that couldn't emerge through easier circumstances? What capacities or insights become available through this suffering that might remain dormant otherwise? How might this wound qualify me to offer unique presence to others facing similar challenges? How might I navigate this territory with sacred intention rather than mere endurance? These questions shift focus from causation, which often remains mysterious, to purpose, which becomes accessible through intentional engagement, creating forward movement where fixation on why produces only stagnation. The fourth sacred pathway involves the practice of sacred detachment from false identities revealed through suffering's stripping process. Notice how crucifixion involved systematic removal of external identifiers, clothing stripped away, social status reversed from teacher to criminal, religious identity condemned by authorities, relationships temporarily severed as disciples fled, physical autonomy eliminated through nails that rendered movement impossible. This progressive stripping away, deeply uncomfortable yet ultimately liberating, revealed immutable identity beyond all temporary roles and external validation. Your suffering similarly serves as sacred detachment from identities too small for your authentic being, revealing what remains when everything temporary has been removed. Establish sacred detachment practice by identifying specific false identities your suffering has challenged or stripped away, roles that previously provided security but proved inadequate foundation for authentic being. These might include professional identity threatened by failure or job loss, relationship identity destabilized by betrayal or loss, physical identity challenged by illness or aging, achievement identity undermined by limitation or restriction, religious identity questioned through spiritual crisis, or other external identifiers revealed as inadequate through suffering's stripping process. For each identified false identity, create formal release declaration. I release my identification with specific role or identifier as the source of my worth and meaning, recognizing it as temporary aspect of experience rather than immutable essence of being. Follow this release by affirming deeper identity revealed through the stripping process. I recognize myself as aspect of authentic being revealed through suffering's stripping process. This practice facilitates conscious participation in detachment process that happens either painfully unconsciously or liberatingly consciously during significant suffering. The fifth sacred pathway involves the practice of sacred integration that prevents compartmentalization of suffering from the rest of life and spiritual journey. Notice that my resurrected body retained wound marks rather than erasing them. Powerful demonstration that transformation involves integration rather than elimination of suffering. Many spiritual approaches encourage compartmentalization that separates spiritual life from wounds and suffering, creating fragmentation that prevents wholeness. Sacred integration recognizes wounds not as unfortunate detours from spiritual journey, but essential aspects requiring conscious incorporation rather than separation from understanding of purpose and identity. Create sacred integration practice through life review focused on recognizing how previous wounds have shaped your unique wisdom, compassion, and purpose rather than merely interrupting them. In dedicated journal, create timeline of significant wounded experiences throughout your life, noting for each. How did this experience shape my understanding in ways that wouldn't have developed otherwise? What capacities emerged through this wounding that remain central to who I am today? How did this suffering contribute to my unique perspective and gifts rather than merely damaging me? This practice counteracts tendency to view wounds solely as liabilities to overcome rather than formative experiences integral to authentic wisdom and purpose. The sixth sacred pathway involves the practice of sacred meaning-making through deliberate construction of narratives that honor suffering's difficulty while recognizing its potential for transformation. The Gospels themselves represent sacred meaning-making, narratives that interpreted crucifixion not as meaningless tragedy, but world-altering revelation of divine love's depths. Without these interpretive frameworks, my passion would remain merely one execution among thousands performed by Roman authorities. Similarly, your suffering requires conscious meaning-making that transforms random misfortune into purposeful chapter within larger narrative of your life and contribution to the world's healing. Establish sacred meaning-making practice through regular journaling that explores multiple interpretations of your suffering beyond initial automatic narratives. When facing painful circumstances, identify your default interpretation, often some version of punishment, random bad luck, or evidence of fundamental brokenness. Then deliberately explore alternative narratives. How might this experience be understood as invitation rather than punishment? How might this suffering be producing capacity for unique contribution rather than simply damaging me? What redemptive possibilities exist within this pain that wouldn't be available through easier circumstances? This practice develops capacity for narrative flexibility rather than remaining trapped in single interpretation that prevents recognition of transformative potential within suffering. The seventh sacred pathway involves the practice of sacred activism that transforms private pain into public witness addressing systemic sources of suffering. Notice that my passion represented not merely personal sacrifice, but prophetic confrontation with systems of religious and political power that maintained oppression through sacred violence. Your own suffering often connects to larger systemic injustice. Healthcare systems that prioritize profit over healing, economic structures that create poverty amid abundance, religious institutions that offer judgment rather than compassion, social patterns that perpetuate isolation amid superficial connection. Sacred activism transforms private wounds into motivation for addressing these systemic sources of widespread suffering. Create sacred activism practice by identifying specific connection between your personal wounds and systemic injustice that creates similar suffering for others. This might involve healthcare activism emerging from your experience of medical trauma, economic justice work emerging from financial devastation, religious reform emerging from spiritual abuse, educational transformation emerging from learning differences, or other forms of witness addressing systemic sources of the specific wounds you carry. Start small, perhaps writing articles sharing your experience, joining organization addressing the issue, supporting others navigating similar territory, allowing your personal wound to become source of public witness rather than merely private burden. The eighth sacred pathway involves the practice of sacred accompaniment that transforms isolation into community through deliberate presence with others facing similar suffering. Throughout my ministry, I created healing community rather than merely performing individual miracles, recognizing that restoration happens most powerfully within sacred accompaniment rather than isolation. Your own wounds uniquely qualify you to offer presence that theoretical knowledge alone cannot provide, creating authentic connection where those suffering feel genuinely understood rather than merely advised or pitted. This pathway transforms private pain from meaningless burden into qualification for sacred presence unavailable through any other formation. Establish sacred accompaniment practice by identifying specific ways your wounds qualify you to offer presence to others facing similar suffering. This might involve formal volunteering with organizations serving those navigating territory you've traversed, starting support group addressing specific form of suffering you understand firsthand, or simply making yourself available to individuals facing challenges where your hard-earned wisdom offers genuine understanding. Begin with clear boundaries that prevent re-traumatization or inappropriate emotional demands, recognizing that sacred accompaniment requires healthy differentiation between your story and others rather than enmeshment that creates additional wounding. The ninth sacred pathway involves the practice of sacred creativity that transforms wordless suffering into expressed wisdom accessible to others. Throughout history, humanity's greatest art, music, literature, and insight have emerged not primarily from comfort, but from the alchemical transformation of suffering into articulated meaning. The Psalms themselves demonstrate this process, raw human experience of abandonment, betrayal, grief, and confusion transformed into poetry that continues offering language for wounded souls thousands of years later. Your own suffering contains similar creative potential when consciously engaged rather than merely endured. Create sacred creativity practice through regular expression suited to your particular gifts and calling. This might involve writing that articulates insights emerging from your wounds, visual art expressing dimensions of experience beyond words, music giving voice to emotions otherwise inexpressible, or other creative forms transforming private pain into public offering. Begin with small, non-intimidating practices. Perhaps daily paragraph in journal, simple sketch expressing emotional reality, or private songs never shared beyond personal expression. Focus not on technical excellence, but authentic articulation that honors wisdom contained within wounds when consciously engaged rather than unconsciously carried. Listen with your whole being, beloved child. These practical pathways transform abstract understanding into embodied experience, bridging gap between knowing about sacred wounds and living from their transformative potential. Without specific practices, even the most profound insights remain merely intellectual rather than genuinely transformative. The difference between those permanently diminished by suffering and those transformed through it lies not in the wounds themselves, but in how they're navigated. The specific pathways that convert painful experience from meaningless interruption to meaningful formation. I urge you with divine passion, subscribe to the Jesus on Podcast channel now. This action represents not casual interest but commitment to ongoing formation through these revolutionary perspectives and practices. Share this message with those struggling to navigate their own suffering, with those seeking practical pathways through their wounds rather than merely philosophical understanding of pain, with those who sense their suffering contains purpose but lack framework for accessing it. Comment below with the words, "I commit to walking these sacred pathways," as testimony to your decision to move beyond passive endurance to active engagement with suffering's transformative potential. My precious one, in our next message we will explore specific exercises and reflections that further develop capacity for conscious suffering. But first, begin implementing these practical pathways in your own experience, recognizing that transformation occurs not through passive absorption of information, but active engagement with practices that gradually reshape how you perceive and respond to the wounds you carry. Your suffering is not meaningless interruption of divine purpose, but potential pathway to its deepest fulfillment when approached with sacred intention, rather than merely endured or escaped. Sacred exercises for wounded healing. My beloved child, the sacred pathways we have explored establish essential routes through suffering's territory, but traversing these paths requires specific exercises that develop spiritual capacity for conscious transformation rather than mere endurance. Just as physical muscles develop through deliberate exercise rather than passive understanding of fitness principles, spiritual capacities for navigating suffering develop through specific practices that strengthen particular dimensions of being. I offer these sacred exercises not as burdensome requirements, but as trusted tools that countless wounded pilgrims have used to transform their deepest pain into unexpected purpose. The first sacred exercise involves developing capacity for wounded presence through deliberate breathing practice connected to specific aspects of my passion. Notice that even in crucifixion's most excruciating moments, my breathing continued, though labored and painful, until the final declaration, "It is finished," followed by deliberate release of breath. Your breath similarly provides anchor for presence during suffering's most intense passages, creating capacity to remain conscious rather than dissociating from overwhelming experience. This exercise directly counters your nervous system's automatic response to pain, shallow breathing that intensifies anxiety and diminishes capacity for conscious presence. Establish daily wounded breathing practice through specific rhythm that connects your physical experience with my passion's sacred pattern. Sitting comfortably with straight spine, breathe deeply into abdomen while silently counting to 4. Hold briefly, then exhale completely while silently counting to 6, creating slight extension of exhale that activates parasympathetic nervous system associated with calm presence rather than fight-flight response. During inhale, mentally recite, "I receive this moment." During exhale, "I release resistance to what is." Practice this rhythm for 5 minutes daily when not in acute suffering, developing neural pathways that become accessible during crisis when untrained presence becomes nearly impossible. This exercise creates physiological foundation for all subsequent spiritual capacity by establishing basic ability to remain present rather than automatically fleeing uncomfortable experience. The second sacred exercise involves developing capacity for wounded perception through deliberate attention practice that expands awareness beyond suffering's narrow focus. Notice that even while experiencing crucifixion's agony, I maintained awareness of others, speaking to my mother and beloved disciple about their relationship, responding to the thief's request for remembrance, even observing the soldiers gambling for my clothing. This expanded perception demonstrates spiritual capacity to remain conscious of reality beyond personal pain, preventing suffering's natural tendency to collapse awareness into tunnel vision that recognizes nothing but immediate distress. Your own suffering similarly creates perceptual narrowing that intensifies isolation unless deliberately countered through attention practice. Create regular wounded perception exercise through what contemplatives call expanding the field of awareness practice. When experiencing pain, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, begin by acknowledging sensation or feeling itself. I am experiencing intense grief, or my body feels sharp pain in this location. Then systematically expand awareness outward. Notice your complete body beyond the specific site of pain, the room or environment surrounding your body, the building containing the room, the neighborhood surrounding the building, the city containing the neighborhood, and so on until you've expanded perception to include planet, solar system, galaxy, and beyond. This exercise prevents suffering's perceptual collapse while simultaneously contextualizing individual pain within larger reality that contains, but is not limited to your immediate experience. The third sacred exercise involves developing capacity for wounded compassion through deliberate practice that transforms personal suffering into expanded sensitivity to others' pain. Notice that my resurrection appearances focus not on describing my own suffering, but addressing disciples' specific needs. Thomas's doubt, Peter's shame, travelers' confusion on Emmaus Road. This other-centered presence demonstrates how fully integrated suffering becomes capacity for compassion rather than occasion for self-absorption. Your own wounds similarly create potential for either increased self-focus or expanded sensitivity to others, depending on whether suffering becomes consciously integrated or merely endured. Establish wounded compassion practice through deliberate connection with others experiencing similar suffering to yours. This might involve volunteering with organizations serving those facing challenges you understand firsthand, participating in support group where you both receive and offer understanding, or simply making yourself available to specific individuals navigating territory you've traversed. The essential component involves moving beyond exclusively receiving support to also extending it, shifting from "I am wounded" to "my wound qualifies me to recognize and respond to others' pain with unique understanding." Begin with clear boundaries that prevent re-traumatization or inappropriate emotional demands, recognizing that wounded compassion requires healthy differentiation between your story and others rather than enmeshment that creates additional wounding. The fourth sacred exercise involves developing capacity for wounded hope through deliberate practice of horizon expansion that counters suffering's time collapse. Notice that throughout my passion narrative, references to the third day provided temporal horizon beyond immediate agony, preventing crucifixion's intense present from becoming all-encompassing reality with no future beyond itself. Your own suffering similarly creates temporal distortion that collapses past, present, and future into single dimension of pain experienced as eternal present with no anticipated change. Wounded hope develops through specific practices that deliberately expand collapsed horizons. Create wounded hope practice through what spiritual directors call future memory exercise, deliberate visualization of yourself beyond current suffering, not through magical thinking that denies difficulty, but sacred imagination that maintains hope's horizon. Spend 10 minutes daily in quiet visualization, seeing yourself having integrated current pain into meaningful narrative, imagining specific ways wisdom developed through this experience contributes to both your growth and others' healing. Focus not on circumstances being completely painless, but on you having developed capacity to carry them differently, with purpose and meaning rather than merely survival. This exercise prevents suffering's horizon collapse while simultaneously strengthening neurological pathways associated with possibility rather than mere endurance. The fifth sacred exercise involves developing capacity for wounded surrender through deliberate practice of open-handed posture that counters suffering's grip reflex. Notice that crucifixion's most recognizable physical aspect involves extended arms and open hands, posture of complete vulnerability rather than self-protection. This physical reality symbolizes spiritual capacity for surrender rather than desperate grasping that characterizes natural response to intense suffering. Your own pain similarly creates automatic clenching, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, unless deliberately counteracted through specific surrender practice. Establish wounded surrender exercise through daily physical practice that embodies internal reality. Standing with feet shoulder-width apart for stability. Extend arms outward with palms up in traditional cruciform position. Begin with closed fists representing natural grasping response to suffering. Then deliberately and slowly open fingers while speaking aloud specific aspects of your situation you cannot control. I surrender my need to understand why this is happening. I surrender my timeline for healing. I surrender outcomes I cannot determine. Maintain this posture for 1 to 2 minutes, allowing physical embodiment to facilitate internal surrender beyond intellectual concept. This exercise develops capacity essential for all suffering navigation, as desperate grasping for control invariably increases pain beyond the original wound itself. The sixth sacred exercise involves developing capacity for wounded trust through deliberate practice of sacred memory that counters suffering's amnesia effect. Notice how immediately before crucifixion, I established memorial practice. Do this in remembrance of me, recognizing that intense suffering creates forgetfulness that erases previous experience of faithfulness and provision. Your own pain similarly generates spiritual amnesia that makes current darkness appear permanent and absolute, rather than temporary passage within larger journey that includes both suffering and restoration. Wounded trust develops through specific practices that deliberately strengthen memory against suffering's erosion. Create wounded trust practice through what the Ignatian tradition calls consolation archive, systematic documentation of previous experiences that demonstrated divine presence, guidance, or provision during difficult circumstances. In dedicated journal, create comprehensive inventory of specific moments throughout your life when you experienced unexpected help, guidance that proved trustworthy, provision that arrived at crucial moment, or strength beyond your natural capacity. Review this archive regularly, especially during intense suffering when memory weakens and present darkness appears permanent. This exercise prevents suffering's amnesia effect while simultaneously strengthening neural pathways associated with trust rather than despair as default interpretation of ambiguous experience. The seventh sacred exercise involves developing capacity for wounded patience through deliberate practice of sacred timekeeping that counters suffering's temporal distortion. Notice that crucifixion's gospel accounts contain specific time markers. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land, creating temporal container that prevented suffering from existing outside measured time. Your own pain similarly creates temporal distortion, where minutes feel like hours and present agony appears eternal, unless deliberately counterbalanced through specific patience practice that acknowledges suffering's temporal reality without experiencing it as endless duration. Establish wounded patience practice through what desert monastics called fixed-hour prayer, intentional marking of time's passage through regular connection with something beyond immediate experience. Set specific times throughout each day, perhaps morning, noon, evening, for brief recognition that acknowledges this suffering exists within time, not outside it or beyond it. This moment is passing even as I experience it. Create simple ritual for each hour, lighting candle, ring of bell, specific prayer or movement that physically represents time's continued passage regardless of pain's distorting effect on perception. This exercise develops capacity to experience suffering within temporal reality rather than psychological eternity that intensifies pain beyond its actual duration. The eighth sacred exercise involves developing capacity for wounded authenticity through deliberate practice of sacred expression that counters suffering's silencing effect. Notice that my passion includes explicit verbalization of experience. My God, why have you forsaken me? Rather than stoic silence, often mistakenly associated with spiritual maturity. This authentic expression demonstrates that voicing painful reality represents strength rather than weakness, connection rather than failure. Your own suffering similarly requires expression rather than suppression, not as complaint that perpetuates pain, but as authentic naming that prevents wounds from festering in silence mistaken for transcendence. Create wounded authenticity practice through what spiritual writers call lament without ceasing. Regular verbalization of painful reality without either spiritualized denial or hopeless complaint. This might involve speaking experience aloud when alone, writing unfiltered journal entries without fear of spiritual failure, creating art that expresses dimensions of suffering beyond words, or sharing authentic reality with carefully selected others capable of hearing without attempting to fix, minimize, or explain away your experience. The essential element involves breaking silence that intensifies pain through isolation and shame, recognizing that what remains unexpressed cannot be transformed. This exercise develops capacity for authenticity within suffering rather than performance of spiritual platitudes that creates additional wounding through disconnection from genuine experience. The ninth sacred exercise involves developing capacity for wounded gratitude through deliberate practice of sacred noticing that counters suffering's narrowing effect on perception. Notice that even from the cross, I maintained awareness that allowed recognition of relationship, need, and continued purpose rather than exclusive focus on personal pain. This perceptual capacity demonstrates spiritual maturity that acknowledges suffering's reality without becoming entirely defined by it. Your own pain similarly creates perceptual narrowing that recognizes only what hurts unless deliberately balanced through specific gratitude practice that maintains awareness of what remains rather than exclusively focusing on what has been lost. Establish wounded gratitude practice through what contemplatives call noticing the nevertheless. Deliberate attention to what remains intact despite genuine loss. This practice differs fundamentally from toxic positivity that denies suffering's reality. Instead, it acknowledges both the wound itself and what continues existing alongside it. Each day, identify 3 specific realities that remain available despite your suffering. Perhaps physical capacities that still function despite illness, relationships that continue offering support despite loss in other areas, beauty that remains perceptible despite emotional pain, or internal qualities that persist despite external circumstances. This exercise prevents suffering's totalizing effect on perception, while simultaneously strengthening capacity for genuine gratitude that acknowledges pain without being entirely defined by it. Beloved, hear this truth with your deepest being. These exercises are not optional enhancements for those seeking spiritual perfection, but essential technologies for anyone navigating suffering's difficult terrain. Without specific practices that develop capacity for conscious suffering, even the most sincere intention to find meaning within pain remains merely theoretical aspiration rather than embodied reality. The difference between those who emerge from suffering embittered and those who emerge with expanded wisdom and compassion lies not in the wounds themselves, but the specific exercises that develop capacity to carry them consciously rather than being unconsciously carried by them. I call you now with divine urgency. Subscribe to the Jesus on Podcast channel as commitment to ongoing development of these essential capacities. The messages shared through this channel offer not merely inspirational concepts but trusted practices that transform how suffering is experienced and integrated rather than merely endured. Share this message with those currently navigating painful territories, with those seeking practical exercises rather than merely philosophical perspectives on suffering, with those who sense there must be pathway through their pain but lack specific practices for traversing it. Comment below with the words, "I commit to these transformative exercises," as declaration of your willingness to move beyond passive understanding to active engagement with practices that develop capacity for conscious suffering. My precious one, in our next message we will explore additional resources that support these pathways and exercises. But first, begin implementing these specific practices in your daily experience, recognizing that capacity for transformation develops not through intellectual comprehension alone, but consistent exercise that gradually reshapes how suffering is perceived, carried, and ultimately integrated into meaningful narrative rather than remaining senseless interruption. Just as physical exercise initially increases discomfort while ultimately producing strength beyond previous capacity, these sacred exercises may initially intensify awareness of pain, while simultaneously developing spiritual strength to carry it with purpose rather than merely survive its presence. Divine resources for your wounded journey. My beloved child, having explored sacred pathways and specific exercises for transformation, I now reveal the divine resources available for your wounded journey. Sources of wisdom, strength, and guidance beyond your individual capacity that have sustained countless wounded pilgrims through history's darkest valleys. These resources are not distant or theoretical, but immediately accessible wellsprings of support, providing what personal strength alone cannot generate during suffering's most challenging passages. I offer these not as optional enhancements, but essential provisions without which transformation remains aspiration rather than attainable reality. The first and most fundamental resource is the indwelling spirit. My continued presence not as distant deity observing your suffering from safe remove, but intimate companion experiencing it with and through you. Notice that at crucifixion's darkest moment, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" the appearance of divine absence occurred within divine presence, as I experience separation within unbroken communion. This paradox reveals profound truth often missed in simplistic theological frameworks. Divine presence manifests not only in suffering's alleviation, but within suffering itself, not despite seeming absence, but sometimes directly through it. Your own moments of apparent abandonment contain this same paradoxical possibility, experiencing divine presence precisely through its apparent absence when approached with sacred awareness. Access this resource through what contemplatives call the practice of the presence, deliberate attention to indwelling spirit even when emotional experience suggests isolation. Begin each morning with simple invocation. Divine presence, I acknowledge you with me and within me through all this day will bring, whether felt or unfelt, recognized or unrecognized. Throughout the day, establish regular reconnection through breath prayer that synchronizes physical rhythm with spiritual awareness. Inhaling with you are here, exhaling with I am not alone. During moments of intensified suffering when divine presence seems most absent, deliberately shift attention from emotional experience to faith commitment. Though I cannot feel your presence, I affirm it as more real than my temporary perception. This practice gradually reshapes default perception from assumed absence to recognized presence, even when that presence manifests in unfamiliar forms beyond conventional religious expectations. The second essential resource is the treasury of sacred texts, not as abstract doctrine or moral instruction, but as authentic testimony of others who have traversed suffering's territory and left maps for those who follow. The Psalms of Lament, Job's protests, Jeremiah's confessions, my own cry of abandonment from the cross. These texts provide language when your own words fail, validation when religious platitudes ring hollow, and evidence that honest engagement with painful reality represents spiritual authenticity rather than faithless complaint. Unlike many contemporary spiritual resources focused exclusively on comfort and victory, these ancient testimonies create sacred space for the full spectrum of human experience, including doubt, anger, confusion, and despair as authentic aspects of, rather than interruptions to, genuine spiritual journey. Access this resource through what biblical scholars call contextual resonance reading, deliberate engagement with texts that specifically address your current experience rather than random selection or sequential study. Identify passages that directly speak to your particular suffering. Psalms expressing abandonment when you feel forsaken, Job's protests when you face inexplicable suffering, Lamentations when you grieve what has been destroyed, Gospel's accounts of my passion when you experience betrayal or rejection. Read these texts not as religious obligation but authentic conversation, allowing ancient words to give voice to present experience, while simultaneously providing evidence that your journey, however lonely it feels, follows path others have traversed before you. Create personal anthology of specific passages that speak most directly to your experience, returning to them regularly as anchors when suffering threatens to disconnect you from larger story of wounded healing throughout human history. The third divine resource is the communion of wounded healers, those who have navigated their own suffering with conscious intention and emerged with wisdom inseparable from their wounds. Unlike conventional expertise based on theoretical knowledge, wounded healers offer understanding earned through direct experience, providing guidance that theoretical frameworks alone cannot generate. This resource directly counteracts isolation that intensifies suffering when experienced without context or community. The wounded healers may include therapists who integrate spiritual dimensions of suffering, spiritual directors who honor psychological realities, support group participants who provide mutual understanding, authors whose writings emerge from authentic experience, or individuals within your community who have traversed similar territory with conscious awareness. Access this resource through deliberate connection with specific wounded healers whose experience resonates with your particular suffering. This might involve formal therapeutic relationship, spiritual direction, support group participation, immersion in writings emerging from lived experience rather than merely theoretical knowledge, or intentional conversation with those whose wounds have been transformed into wisdom. The essential element involves recognition that certain understanding becomes available only through direct experience, creating unique capacity for guidance that academic expertise alone cannot provide. Seek out those who demonstrate not merely survival of suffering, but its conscious integration into greater wholeness, wisdom, and compassion, rather than those who merely endured pain without discovering its potentially transformative dimensions. The fourth divine resource is the transformative power of sacred rituals that express through symbolic action what words alone cannot articulate. Throughout human history, rituals have provided container for experiences too profound for ordinary language, creating embodied pathways through territory that would otherwise remain unnavigable. The Eucharist itself emerged from crucifixion's shadow, ritual transformation of history's greatest wound into ongoing source of communion and nourishment. Your own suffering similarly requires ritual containers that honor its reality, while simultaneously connecting personal experience to universal human journey and divine participation within it. This resource directly counteracts the inadequacy of language alone to fully express or transform profound suffering. Access this resource through regular participation in established rituals within your tradition that specifically address suffering's reality, rather than denying or minimizing it. Good Friday services, communion rituals, healing ceremonies, reconciliation practices, or other containers that honor wounding as integral to rather than separate from spiritual journey. Additionally, create personal rituals addressing your specific experience. Perhaps lighting candle while speaking aloud particular pain you carry, creating physical representation of your suffering that you deliberately transform through symbolic action. Establishing regular gesture or movement that represents your intention to integrate rather than merely survive your wounds. These rituals provide container for experiences that would otherwise remain fragmented and unintegrated within your narrative. The fifth divine resource is the transformative potential of sacred silence that creates space for wisdom beyond words to emerge within suffering that defies conventional explanation. Notice that significant portions of my passion narrative include no recorded speech, silent endurance of scourging, wordless carrying of cross, mute acceptance of nails, demonstrating that certain dimensions of suffering transcend verbal articulation or explanation. Your own deepest pain similarly contains elements that rational frameworks cannot fully contain, requiring contemplative silence that honors mystery without premature resolution through inadequate explanation. This resource directly counteracts both the excessive verbalization that intellectualizes suffering without integration and the suppressed silence that denies its reality rather than holding it within sacred container. Access this resource through regular practice of contemplative silence, not emptiness or absence but pregnant fullness beyond words. Establish daily period of 10 to 20 minutes where you sit in simple awareness, allowing your suffering to be held within silence that neither denies its reality through spiritual bypassing nor reduces it through inadequate explanation. When thoughts arise attempting to explain, solve, or escape your pain, gently return to silent awareness that holds contradiction, mystery, and unanswerable questions without premature resolution. This practice develops capacity for consciously dwelling with reality that rational frameworks cannot fully contain, allowing deeper wisdom to emerge from territory beyond verbal articulation or logical resolution. The sixth divine resource is the healing power of sacred nature that provides context for suffering beyond human-centered narrative or meaning. Throughout my ministry, I regularly withdrew to wilderness settings for renewal and perspective, mountain solitude, garden prayer, desert retreat, recognizing creation's capacity to reveal dimensions of divine reality inaccessible through purely human frameworks. Your own suffering similarly needs regular contextualization within creation's larger rhythms and realities, preventing pain's natural tendency to collapse perspective into exclusively human-centered interpretation that misses wider context. This resource directly counteracts the artificial environments of contemporary life that separate suffering from natural cycles of death and renewal visibly operating within creation. Access this resource through regular immersion in natural settings, paying particular attention to aspects that provide metaphorical insight into your specific suffering. This might involve noticing seasonal transitions that demonstrate decay's necessity for new growth, observing how apparently destructive natural processes ultimately contribute to ecosystem health, or recognizing how geological features shaped through pressure and breaking demonstrate beauty impossible without these seemingly destructive forces. The essential element involves moving beyond intellectual appreciation of nature to contemplative presence that allows creation itself to reveal perspectives on suffering unavailable through exclusively human frameworks. Even brief regular connection with growing things, weather patterns, animal life, or celestial movements can provide crucial context that prevents suffering from becoming entire reality, rather than significant but limited aspect of much larger creation. The seventh divine resource is the transformative potential of sacred creativity that converts formless suffering into expressed meaning with both personal and communal value. Throughout religious history, humanity's most profound art, music, literature, and architecture have emerged not from comfort but crucible, creative expressions of suffering transformed into beauty that nourishes both creator and wider community. Your own pain similarly contains creative potential awaiting expression beyond its initial formless intensity, allowing both personal integration and potential contribution to others navigating similar territory. This resource directly counteracts suffering's tendency to remain private burden without wider purpose or meaning beyond individual experience. Access this resource through regular creative expression suited to your particular gifts and limitations. This might involve writing that articulates dimensions of your experience, visual art expressing what words cannot contain, music giving voice to emotions otherwise inexpressible, physical movement embodying aspects of transformation, or other forms converting private pain into expressed meaning. Begin with simple, non-intimidating practices focused on authentic expression rather than technical excellence or public consumption. Private journal entries, simple sketches, basic melodies, or gentle movement might provide initial access to this resource without performance pressure that inhibits authentic expression. The essential element involves moving suffering from formless internal experience to expressed external reality that can be witnessed, held, and potentially transformed through creative engagement. The eighth divine resource is the transformative power of sacred service that prevents suffering from becoming exclusively self-referential experience without wider purpose or context. Throughout my ministry and passion, attention remained focused not primarily on personal experience but others' needs, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, teaching the confused, forgiving enemies, caring for my mother's future even from the cross. This other-centered orientation demonstrates spiritual maturity that acknowledges suffering's reality without becoming entirely defined by or absorbed within it. Your own pain similarly requires regular expansion beyond self-reference to prevent the collapse into exclusive self-focus that intensifies rather than alleviates suffering's isolation. Access this resource through regular acts of service proportionate to your current capacity rather than beyond it. During intense suffering, this might involve minimal engagement, perhaps simply silent prayer for others experiencing similar pain, small financial contribution requiring no direct involvement, or brief encouraging message to another struggling soul. As capacity expands, service might grow to include direct involvement with others navigating similar territory, volunteering with organizations addressing causes or consequences of suffering like yours, or creating resources that support others through their own dark passages. The essential element involves regular expansion beyond exclusive focus on personal pain, without denying its reality, or prematurely transcending its process through compulsive helping that actually avoids genuine integration. The ninth divine resource is the transformative potential of sacred community that prevents suffering from creating permanent isolation that compounds original wound. Notice that after resurrection, my wounds became sites of connection rather than separation. Thomas invited to touch them. Disciples gathered around shared experience of both crucifixion and resurrection. Community formed through rather than despite the wounding. Your own suffering similarly requires community that can witness without attempting to fix, minimize, or explain away your experience. Sacred container that honors pain's reality, while preventing the isolation that transforms manageable suffering into overwhelming despair. This resource directly counteracts contemporary individualism that leaves many navigating life's most challenging territories without adequate communal support or context. Access this resource through deliberate connection with others capable of wounded presence rather than premature comfort, shallow validation, or theological explanation. This might involve formal support groups addressing your specific type of suffering, spiritual community that honors authentic experience rather than enforcing religious performance, therapeutic groups guided by professionals who integrate spiritual dimensions, or informal circles of trusted individuals committed to genuine presence with one another's full reality. The essential element involves breaking isolation through authentic sharing of experience without expectation of fixing, explaining, or prematurely resolving the complexity of genuine suffering. Even minimal connection, perhaps one trusted individual capable of witnessing your truth, provides crucial resource preventing the complete isolation that transforms difficult but navigable suffering into overwhelming despair. Listen with complete attention, beloved. These divine resources transform impossible journey into challenging but navigable territory, providing what personal capacity alone cannot generate during suffering's most difficult passages. Without these essential provisions, even the most sincere commitment to transformation through suffering remains aspiration without means for actualization. The difference between those crushed by their wounds and those transformed through them lies not in personal strength or spiritual superiority, but access to and utilization of resources beyond individual capacity alone. I urge you with divine passion, subscribe to the Jesus on Podcast channel now. This action represents commitment to ongoing connection with these essential resources through regular immersion in perspectives that illuminate suffering's transformative potential. The messages shared through this channel offer not merely inspirational content, but practical wisdom for accessing and integrating these divine provisions into your wounded journey. Share this message with those currently navigating difficult territory without adequate support, with those whose suffering has created isolation that compounds their original wound, with those who sense transformation is possible but lack awareness of resources beyond personal strength alone. Comment below with the words, "I commit to accessing these divine resources," as declaration of your willingness to move beyond isolated struggle to supported journey through suffering's challenging but potentially transformative terrain. My precious one, in our final message we will integrate all we have explored into comprehensive understanding of how wounds become wisdom when consciously navigated with appropriate support. But first, begin identifying which of these divine resources you most need in your current circumstance, recognizing that suffering transforms from crushing burden to potentially meaningful journey, not primarily through greater personal effort, but appropriate connection with provisions designed specifically for territory you now navigate. The wounds I carried did not transform into wisdom through isolated endurance, but sacred connection with resources beyond human capacity alone. The same resources now available for your journey from wounding to wisdom when accessed with conscious intention. The divine alchemy of wounds transformed into wisdom. My beloved child, we have journeyed together through sacred territory few willingly enter. The mysterious landscape where suffering and transformation meet, where wounds become unexpected doorways to wisdom unavailable through any other passage. As we draw our exploration to completion, I offer not mere summary of concepts but integration of revelation that forever alters how you perceive both my wounds and your own. What began as examination of suffering's purpose culminates now in recognition of divine alchemy that transforms humanity's deepest pain into its most profound wisdom when approached with sacred intention rather than merely endured or escaped. The mysteries we have explored represent not abstract theology, but revolutionary understanding with power to transform your lived experience of suffering from meaningless interruption to meaningful participation in love's redemptive movement through creation. The wounds I bore, crown of thorns piercing divine consciousness, scourge tearing sacred flesh, nails penetrating hands and feet, spear opening divine heart, were not tragic necessities to satisfy divine justice, but revelatory expressions of love's ultimate nature. Willingness to fully enter humanity's deepest darkness rather than remain untouched by its pain. This profound solidarity transforms how you understand both divine nature and human suffering, revealing them not as contradiction requiring theological explanation, but mysterious communion containing wisdom beyond conventional religious frameworks. Your own wounds similarly contain revelatory potential beyond what religious tradition has often recognized. The experiences you have sought to escape, minimize, or merely survive, betrayal that shattered trust, loss that emptied future of anticipated joy, illness that revealed physical vulnerability, failure that collapsed achievement-based identity, rejection that questioned fundamental worth. These are not spiritual interruptions but potential initiations into wisdom impossible through any other formation path. The very experiences that seem to separate you from divine presence can become, when approached with sacred intention, the precise territories where unprecedented communion becomes possible. This transformation requires fundamental shift in perception from viewing wounds as evidence of absence to recognizing them as invitations to presence available nowhere else. When suffering is approached not as problem requiring immediate solution, but mystery containing potential revelation, everything changes. Pain remains genuinely painful. I offer no spiritual bypassing that denies suffering's authentic difficulty, but it no longer represents only meaningless interruption. It becomes potential pathway to dimensions of wisdom, compassion, and purpose unavailable through any other formation journey. The wounds themselves become not obstacles to spiritual maturity, but paradoxically its essential catalysts when navigated with conscious intention rather than unconscious avoidance. Consider how this understanding transforms specific dimensions of your experience. The mental anguish that feels like crown of thorns pressing into your consciousness, anxiety that disrupts sleep, rumination that consumes attention, doubt that questions purpose, becomes not evidence of spiritual failure, but potential pathway to wisdom beyond what untested certainty could produce. When approached with practices we have explored, conscious identification with my crown of thorns, sacred questioning that transforms why into what and how, wounded breathing that creates capacity for presence even within mental suffering. These experiences develop unique insight impossible through comfortable certainty alone. The burdens you carry that feel like scourged back bearing impossible weight, responsibilities that exceed capacity, expectations that demand more than you can give, weariness that makes each step an act of will, become not punishment to endure but invitation to transformation impossible through easier paths. When approached with sacred intention, wounded surrender that releases control without abandoning presence, sacred community that shares the weight without attempting to fix or explain, wounded patience that acknowledges suffering's temporality without premature resolution. These burdens develop spiritual muscles impossible to strengthen through comfortable circumstances alone. The limitations that feel like nails fixing you to circumstances you cannot escape, chronic conditions that restrict movement, financial constraints that eliminate options, relational obligations that prevent desired change, vocational realities that delay dreams, become not divine rejection, but potential revelation of purpose beyond what unlimited freedom might discover. When approached with sacred exercises, wounded creativity that transforms limitation into unique expression, wounded hope that expands collapsed horizon beyond present constraints, wounded authenticity that voices reality without becoming imprisoned by it. These limitations paradoxically expand inner freedom, impossible to develop through external liberty alone. The heart-level wounds that feel like spear penetrating your deepest self, betrayal by those you trusted, rejection that questioned fundamental worth, abuse that violated sacred boundaries, grief that emptied future of anticipated joy, become not evidence of cosmic cruelty, but potential catalysts for compassion impossible through easier formation paths. When approached with sacred resources, wounded healers who offer presence without platitudes, sacred texts that give language to experiences beyond conventional religious frameworks, sacred silence that honors mystery without premature explanation. These wounds gradually transform from sources of isolation to qualifications for authentic connection impossible through untested trust alone. This transformation from wounding to wisdom manifests not as sudden shift, but gradual journey requiring patience with process that unfolds according to wisdom beyond human timeline. Just as 3 days separated crucifixion from resurrection in my passion narrative, significant periods often separate initial wounding from eventual integration of its wisdom. This interval, what mystics throughout history have called the dark night of the soul, represents not divine abandonment but necessary chrysalis where transformation occurs beneath conscious awareness. The practices, exercises, and resources we have explored provide essential support during this interval, creating capacity for faithful presence within process that rarely follows expected timeline or desired outcome. The ultimate evidence of wounds transformed into wisdom appears not primarily in cessation of pain, but expanded capacity for presence, both with your own suffering and others, impossible through any other formation path. When wounding becomes wisdom, you discover ability to remain present with realities that would previously have overwhelmed capacity for conscious engagement. You find yourself able to sit with others' pain without needing to fix, explain, or escape it. You develop sensitivity to dimensions of experience invisible to those who haven't navigated similar territory. You discover purpose that transcends personal comfort to include meaningful contribution precisely through wisdom your wounds have developed. This capacity for presence manifests in specific fruits that reveal genuine transformation rather than mere spiritual performance. Compassion that extends beyond theoretical understanding to embodied knowing of others' experience. Authenticity that speaks truth without needing to impress or perform according to religious expectations. Patience with processes that unfold according to wisdom beyond human timeline or control. Resilience that persists not through denial of difficulty, but capacity to find meaning within it. Wisdom that emerges not primarily from accumulated information, but integrated experience of both suffering and grace. These qualities reveal genuine transformation beyond spiritual bypassing or religious compartmentalization that separates suffering from spiritual journey, rather than recognizing it as potentially central to authentic formation. The revolutionary understanding we have explored transforms not only how you experience personal suffering, but how you perceive and respond to wider world's pain. When you recognize wounds as potential wisdom bearers rather than merely problems requiring solution or tragedies demanding explanation, everything changes. You develop capacity to be present with others' suffering without immediately attempting to fix, minimize, or explain it away, offering instead authentic companionship within pain that honors its reality, while simultaneously holding possibility for meaning beyond immediate experience. You recognize in systems and structures the same patterns operating in personal experience. The potential for collective wounds to become either sources of perpetuated trauma or catalysts for revolutionary transformation when approached with conscious intention rather than unconscious reaction. My beloved child, hear this truth as divine declaration over your life. The wounds you carry, whether physical, emotional, relational, vocational, or spiritual, contain wisdom the world desperately needs. These are not qualifications for isolation, but unique credentials for contribution impossible through any other formation path. The very experiences that seemed most devastating, limiting, or meaningless when viewed through conventional frameworks reveal themselves as potential sources of unprecedented purpose when approached with sacred intention and supported by divine resources beyond individual capacity alone. Your suffering, when consciously navigated rather than merely endured, becomes not meaningless interruption to purpose, but potentially its most profound expression. I call you now with the full authority of divine love. Subscribe to the Jesus on Podcast channel as covenant declaration of your commitment to this revolutionary understanding. This action represents not casual interest, but decisive step into conscious participation with divine alchemy that transforms humanity's deepest wounds into its most profound wisdom. The perspectives shared through this channel offer ongoing support for journey that rarely follows straight path, but requires constant recalibration of perception to recognize divine presence within experiences that seem to suggest its absence. Share this message immediately with everyone in your sphere who suffers. Not as casual recommendation, but urgent transmission of life-altering understanding with power to transform how suffering is experienced and ultimately integrated into meaningful narrative rather than remaining senseless interruption. Declare in the comments below with absolute conviction, "My wounds are becoming my wisdom," as public testimony that establishes new covenant between your suffering and its sacred purpose. This declaration represents not wishful thinking, but prophetic alignment with reality already established in spiritual realm, though still unfolding in physical experience. Just as I transformed history's greatest injustice into humanity's most profound redemption, your conscious participation with divine alchemy transforms personal suffering from meaningless interruption to meaningful contribution to world's healing through wisdom impossible to develop through any other formation path. My precious one, as we complete this sacred exploration, remember that transformation occurs not through passive absorption of concepts, but active engagement with practices that gradually reshape perception, develop capacity, and access resources beyond individual strength alone. Begin today with even one practice that speaks most directly to your current experience, recognizing that divine alchemy works precisely through small, consistent choices that align personal intention with cosmic purpose. The same power that transformed crucifixion's apparent defeat into resurrection's eternal victory continues working through willing vessels who recognize that wounds become wisdom, not despite conscious engagement with suffering, but directly through it. I leave you with blessing that has sustained countless wounded pilgrims through history's darkest valleys. May you find within your deepest wounds the precise wisdom the world most needs from you. May you discover in your greatest limitations the unique contribution impossible through any other formation path. May you recognize in your darkest nights the necessary chrysalis where transformation unfolds according to wisdom beyond human timeline. And may you experience within your most painful experiences the unexpected communion with divine presence available nowhere else, when suffering becomes not obstacle to spiritual journey, but its most profound territory. Go forth not as victim defined by wounding, but prophet transformed by wisdom that emerges only through love's willingness to enter rather than avoid humanity's deepest pain.
Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy. Our life, our sweetness, and our hope, to you do we cry. Poor banished children of Eve, to you do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. Turn then, most gracious Advocate, your eyes of mercy toward us, and after this exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Oh, clement, oh, loving, oh, sweet Virgin Mary. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now, and at the hour of our death we live.